Although I can't definitively prove this, there are certain vehicles in Gran Turismo which have always given me the vibe that Kaz might have driven something on a particular track day or just likes a certain car, and that's why it ends up in the game. And even though I can't say, as I said specifically, whether or not that's the case here, it kind of gives me that vibe, because it seems like an oddly specific AMG to choose. Sure, some of them make sense, the AMG GT, the GTR, the Black Series, even the A-Class makes sense from a hot hatch point of view. This one seems oddly specific though, and of course this car represents quite the jump in technology and a wildly different approach to the last C63 which we had, which was the more traditional super saloon with the 6.2 V8 and what was it, around 450, 460 horses if I recall correctly. Incidentally, I've reviewed that era in real life as well here on the channel, both the wagon and the saloon, and they did not disappoint. I'm yet to drive one of these in real life, but I'm sure that for all of the advances in tech, it wouldn't necessarily have as much personality as those older AMGs, or at least that's what I would suspect. In terms of performance, well, it's very good. 503 horses from that V8 engine. The weight, of course, is fairly high, being a luxury performance Mercedes, but it's not too crazy. 1,725 kilos, of course, is a C-Class coupe rather than a super saloon, and in terms of torque, well, not exactly lacking on any AMG anyway, but in terms of the point level, it has changed a little bit. Very early on in the game cycle, I noted down a whole bunch of different cars to do reviews for, and back then, this was 569 points. Through different updates and changes, and now of course the physics revisions in the game, it's jumped a little bit up from 569 to 573. So not a crazy difference, but a difference nonetheless. And the price tag, it's kind of a cliche that Mercedes, among many other European exotic brands, are always more expensive than their rivals in Gran Turismo games. This, although not crazy, is kind of the same thing. 135 grand if you compare that to the equivalent like Japanese car, even something like a GTR, I guess you could say would be a rival for it. It's a whole lot cheaper than this, and that's always been the Mercedes way. For some reason it's always Mercedes and Aston Martin that kind of jumps out at me in terms of being quite expensive. I guess Jag as well, especially in the older Gran Turismo games. What's really interesting to me about this car specifically though, is that in this form, which of course for those who follow special projects, well, first things first, you'll recognise a ton of cars in this race because they're all pretty much special projects, but also this one was a build which I did. But more specifically, the one that I'm driving is of course my fictional Black Series version of this car. I envisioned kind of like a CLK 63 Black Series equivalent from this era. So the smaller ducktail wing, the pumped up body kit, and more of a focus on those roots of being an AMG muscle car rather than the more supercar approach which their later Black Series stuff has. In other words, kind of like the AMG Black Series that Clarkson really loved, which, if I recall, was the CLK 63. What's interesting to me, though, is that I have not driven this since the physics changes. So I did that build months before those changes, and yet this thing feels great. And if anything, I think it might actually handle a bit better now, unless it's just me. This thing is great through corners, and not to toot my own flute, but it was actually so good to drive now that it inspired me to go back and make a new variation, which is going to come in a future special projects pack at some point, one which I think you're going to like quite a bit. Now this car to me is not one which I would put in the essential purchases column, but it's more so what I would put in the middle ground between don't buy it and do buy it. Which sounds like a negative thing, but what I mean by that is that middle area is the you don't need it, but if you buy it you'll be pleasantly surprised kind of camp. It's not a car which you'll necessarily jump to first, and it's not a car which you'll necessarily use all the time, but it's pretty damn fun, it's pretty damn quick, and as you can see here in the race, even up against cars which I built with more horsepower, less weight, sometimes strictly speaking better performance cars you would think, it still performs really, really well against them. This form, for example, was a 603 horsepower car that still weighed 1,650 kilos, so it's not like I went crazy with that build anyway, and yet, spoiler alert, the only car out of my garage which managed to stay ahead of me on this track was a non-special projects version, more of a Liberty Walk kind of thing that I did for the Maserati Gran Turismo. That's around a 650 horsepower car with very little weight and crazy camber. I would say that my thoughts on this car are nothing particularly crazy, because the car itself isn't anything particularly crazy. It's just kind of what you'd expect. It's a very refined, very capable feeling, big old hunk of German performance metal. It doesn't really reinvent the wheel, and I'm sure in real life it would feel much more engaging and much more impressive to drive. To me, the best thing about this era the new A-Class, the AMG GT, this one as well, is that it feels like Mercedes is back on form. The unfortunate thing is you can't really fully feel that in a game as much as you can in real life. Like I said, you don't have to buy one, but if you do, you might be pleasantly surprised. And if you do decide to buy it, it's an interesting alternative to your Corvettes, the Dodge Demon, stuff like that. Not necessarily always as powerful as them, but not usually too far behind, and pretty good through corners too for a vehicle of its size and weight. So if you do get a minute to try one out, if you've got it in your garage doing nothing, you might want to try out the Black Series build that I did, and of course, like I said, stick around in a future special projects pack for another variation of this car coming along. Hopefully sooner than later we'll get some Gran Turismo update news, but it doesn't seem to be the way for this month at least, and of course I'll see you next time. But for now, thanks for watching.